All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming for this conversation, which is a part of the Inspiration Forum at Ji.hlava Documentary Film Festival this year. I'll switch to Czech very briefly. Já chci jenom říct, že v případě, že byste chtěli překlad, tlumočení, tak tam máte možnost pořád si vzít nějaké překladací zařízení, abyste mohli mít tlumočení z angličtiny do češtiny. Jelikož stejně jako já, moderátor, taky Monika bude mluvit anglicky. Jenom taková krátká informační vsuvka. And now I'm switching back to English. My name is Lukáš, Likavčan, and I'm a philosopher focused on technology, ecology, and visual cultures, and I'll be guiding you through this conversation tonight. The conversation is called Unheard Relations, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about the general concept of this conversation, and I'm also going to introduce you our dear guest in a brief moment. When looking at the plant, we usually only see what is on the surface, the stem, the trunk, and the leaves of the flower. But there is so much more underground. There's complex networks of roots through which water and nutrients flow. However, even that is not everything. Like animals, plants can also exhibit properties such as knowledge and collectivity. Like animals, they are always interconnected. They form communities, and they have intricate communication networks. They have memory, and they can even learn. Hence, understanding the plant universe through pioneering discovering using unusual methods, such as those by our dear guests today, can give us a new perspective on nature. And so, who is the person that is going to tell us the unheard news from the kingdom of plants? It is going to be Monica Gagliano, who's a researcher and associate professor in evolutionary ecology at Southern Cross University, where she also directs the Biological Intelligence Lab, which is a part of Diverse Intelligence initiative of the Templeton World Charity Foundation. She has pioneered the brand new field of plant bioacoustics, and her work also has extended the concept of cognition in plants, including perception, learning, or memory. By demonstrating experimentally that learning is not the exclusive provenance of animals, she has reignited the discourse on plant subjectivity and the ethical and legal standing of flora. Her latest book is called Thus Spoke the Plant, which is a remarkable journey of groundbreaking scientific discoveries and personal encounters with plants. So, Monica, I'm so happy to have you here tonight with us. How's Australia?
It's night.
It's actually
it's
evening there,
already.
Right?
That's right. I'm talking to you from the future. It's already 10 o'clock at night of your Saturday morning.
It's great you bring future, because I want to talk a bit more about the timeline of this conversation. And a bit of housekeeping for the audience as well. I will begin now in this kind of effort to get as much information as possible about plant language and plant communication by asking Monica a few introductory questions. There's going to be something like creating like a knowledge base for the later conversation, and to also kind of like a precondition for also opening the discussion to you, the audience. This first part that I'm going to conversate in a dialogue with Monica, that's going to last for roughly 45, max 50 minutes, and then we will have maximum half an hour for a conversation with all of you here in the room. By the way, it's so nice to hear a full room of people watching a lecture. I haven't seen it actually in almost 2 years, so thanks so much for coming, all of you again. And yeah, I think that's all. That's the schedule. And Monica, since you work in this kind of new field of bioacoustics and plant communication, or plant linguistics, if you will, can you tell us more about like what's the first step we have to do to understand the language of plants or language of animals, how to redefine language itself to actually make this kind of like perspectival rotation, if you will, work for us?
Well, I think it's a big exercise, but also an important one that we really need to make. Because as a species, humans are so obsessed with very specific modes of communicating, and that's what we call language. What I'm doing with you right now, that's what we call language. And we can even, we have some flexibility, and we can, speak different languages. I mean, I'm now using, this is not my mother tongue, and you also are not using your mother tongue, and we are finding a medium that can allow us to communicate. But fundamentally, the putting together of words that can make some meaning that we can recognize is what we define as language. And we often just assume that we're the only one that do this. We give a credit to some animals that are really obvious to us, like, say birds. When we are observing birds, we can tell that they are communicating, and they're obviously using their songs to tell some story. We can recognize some of the other mammals, and definitely if you have a dog or a cat, you will know that they're very communicative, and they will definitely talk to you in their own cat and dog language. And somehow, without the need of translation, we are able to understand that language. And I guess the animals that are close to us might be a good place for us to start approaching even the question, because to get out of the way from ourselves is the problem here. And the animals that are close to us help us to do that, because we are doing that naturally. And that is pretty much the main point that I think I want to make, that this is actually the ability to communicate with other species is a natural thing. It's not something strange, it's not something magical, it's not even something weird. We've been doing this for millennia, otherwise our species wouldn't be here. It's just that I guess maybe more recently, in the last few centuries, we've become very obsessed with certain specific modes. Now, when we come to animals that are very similar to us, let's take the dog, your dog, your puppy dog, or your cat. They got eyes. They got a mouth. Often I have a dog, and I often look at my dog, and I'm certain that he's smiling, And of course, in a way, I am projecting myself and what I consider a smile look like onto my dog. And I am assuming, because when I smile, I'm happy, that when my dog is smiling, that it's a language that is saying, I am happy too. Although in the case of my dog, I also know now that he's using his tail to tell me how happy he is. And that is also language. So, suddenly there is, and he can make funny noises that are just like letting me know that he's very excited. So there is, the obvious sound and words that we are sharing that are part of that language. But clearly, in the case of a dog, like the expression, the facial expression, and the entire body expression, the tail typically, give away the message. And the further away we go from bodies that we recognize literally, the physicality of it, so the bodies that we recognize as our own. So, dogs and humans are very different, clearly, but we can recognize that they got eyes and they got legs, and the tail, it looks a bit funny, but we can kind of sympathize with that, because I always wanted to have a tail since I was a child. And humans kind of have a tail. It's just so reduced that we don't use it. But the point is that the further away we go from that form, that physical form, the harder it gets for us to literally empathize with that form and understand it in a way that feels like, oh, it's actually communicating with me, it's actually sharing something with me. So, further away from mammals, and then further away from birds who also have eyes, but they're already looking a bit weird because they have beaks and they don't really have like arms, they got wings instead. So they start getting a bit weird. And then as soon as we get onto things like fish, for example, we find it very difficult to empathize with that, because They do have eyes, but they're so weird. You know, like they go fins, the bodies are such a different shape. They live in a totally different environment that is not what we are familiar with, because even when we go and we enter in the environment, it's not our comfort zone. And then the further away you go from that place, the harder it gets. So by the time you get to plants, and let alone like plants is easy, by the time you get to bacteria or mushrooms, then it becomes almost impossible for us to recognize that there is an opportunity for us to even communicate with bacteria and mushrooms. It just, even as I say, it sounds like, is she crazy? But fundamentally, there is no reason why not. And in fact, actually with bacteria, we do communicate all the time. They're in your guts. And if there was not functional communication, like so a clear and proper communication, again, we will be dead, because the entire support system for this body to function and be alive depends on that communication between the two species, the human and the bacteria living in our guts. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that we are quite superficial in our definition of what we classify and define as language and the possibility for communication. From my take and also my personal experience, I feel that really plants are just an example of a species that is, of a group of species, because there is a lot of plants. It's a space where we find ourselves a little bit lost, because they're so different physically from us. They're not even made of the same, apparently, of the same superficially building blocks. You know, they don't have blood. They don't bleed. They don't. They don't have eyes as such. They don't have ears as such. We are finding it difficult to recognize ourselves there. But the communication doesn't rely on those physical structures, basically, and it is up to us to discover how we are actually very well tuned to communicate without using even ourselves those physical structures. Communication can happen in other ways, and fundamentally, I think communication and language in the sense of signals and gestures that are exchanged and they produce meaning in that relational space of exchange, they occur everywhere. And is an entire, you mentioned in the introduction, you mentioned how, plants and animals are kind of all enmeshed in this web of relationship, basically. And so we see ourselves as separate from that enmeshment, but actually if we can learn to see ourselves part of that mesh, because we are part of that tapestry, then the idea that we will be in communication with everything, no matter whether it's a bacteria, plant, or my puppy dog, makes total sense, because like we are in communication and in connection and part of it, even when we are not paying attention. And then when we pay attention, it's just a matter of like, oh, now I get what is being exchanged, maybe, or I have an awareness of what is being shared. So
thanks, Monica. I was thinking that in relation to extending this notion of language, I had a chance to read thoroughly one of your essays that comes from the volume called The Language of Plants that you also edited. And I found a very poetic sentence there by you, which actually taps well into this introductory remarks of yours. It goes like this: what if language is a fundamentally natural and inevitable consequence of being that emerges as an organism makes meaning of its surroundings and, in turn, engraves the very identity of that organism and its physical embodiment in its world? This kind of the way how you put it, it really resembles a concept by Jakob von Uexküll of Umwelt, or of dwelling world or life world. And I think that's one of those concepts that really sit on the bedrock thinking about the language in this extended sense. So can you introduce it a bit more? Because I know you also use this concept quite a lot in your work.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's really, first of all, it's a very useful term because I think, you know, the direct translation would be the environment, but that doesn't actually translate what that word really captures. So I'm very fascinated by that word, and because it gives so much. And again, talking about language is like, here is an example of something that is just so full and rich, and it's just a little sound. I guess maybe the best way to approach this is, I mean, of course, that is very well embedded in the semiotic and biosemiotic area of investigations, which is not my area of expertise, but I sympathize. But maybe a way to approach this would be to take a step back, and look at the classic or older approach to cognition. So cognition is a big word again that represents and contains a lot of other big words, but to which we are familiar. So cognition would be something that would include, you know, learning and memory and making decisions. So all of this capacity for choice, perception. Now, in the more classical way, cognition is being thought of as a function of the brain. And you have to have a brain and a nervous system to be able to be cognitive, so to do any of those activities that I just mentioned. And of course, humans totally qualify because we are actually taken as the golden standard for it. And because the term was kind of really used during the cybernetic emergence of cybernetics, it was easily extended to the machines. So a computer can be cognitive, but to extend it to anything else that, like a plant, for example, that doesn't actually have a brain or neurons, becomes problematic. Now, the main reason why I'm bringing this definition of cognition, which technically is called cognitivism, is because it is an older view, which it doesn't actually contain in its own definition, doesn't require, and it doesn't contain the environment. So it's all about something that it's related to a particular structure, the brain and the nervous system, and that is where things happen. And so if you got one of those structures, you should be good, and you are creating, basically like a computer. You are taking inputs in, data coming from outside. That is as far as the environment is involved. Everything happens inside your head, in our case, and then the idea goes that somehow your brain makes sense of the inputs, and there is an output, and the output is what you're doing next. So you make your decision based on how the input got processed by your brain. Well, aside from the fact that that looks very much like a machine and it's a bit reductionist, but it's a very, you know, it was a very well accepted view, and it still is quite strongly accepted by many people. And it's almost simple enough that it makes sense. And but maybe it's just a bit too simplistic and a bit too naive, and it's missing the very essence of life, which is not a thing, but a process. And so post-cognitivists, so the ones that decided like, well, you know, this theory seems a bit weird. What they did was to, I think, bring the environment right into the picture, and even suggest that maybe the cognition thing is not a thing, but is a process that occurs as a set of relationships. So there is no such a thing as an input-output and something happens in your brain, but it's more about how these different bits of information are put in relation, and cognition then occurs not inside you or anywhere else, but by the space that arises when you, as the physical body, interacts within a certain environment, and or in relation to someone else or others. So suddenly you can see that in the first model of cognition, you can be on your own and you think that you're being cognitive. In the second model, you have to realize that your definition of yourself as a cognitive being, so a being that can think or can learn or can speak or can communicate, is intrinsically reliant on the fact that you are embedded in an environment always, even when you are in lockdown because of COVID and they put you in a room on your own because you have to quarantine, you're still relating to the mask that you have to wear, the space in the room, the temperature, everything that is around you, the sound that is from outside the room that penetrates and permeates in. So all of that makes that moment for you. And I would say, going to a step further, is like what that means is actually that you and all of these other aspects of the environment, as we call it, around you, including all the sounds, all the smells, everything, the light, they actually not only make you in that moment, but by making who you are in that moment right there, but in the making of you, you're also making them, because there is a feedback and you are exchanging constantly. So as you change because a bird was singing outside your window, that makes you feel happy, you change, and suddenly your environment has changed, the environment, which includes you. So from this perspective, the first system is very closed. It's like as long as you have input, output, and everything is inside this box. But in the second version of the model for cognition, you would have a system that is completely open and permeable. And if this was a container that was supposed to contain water, it will, trickle water everywhere, but also it will be filled up all the time too. And so I guess for me, that is really what the Umwelt is. This idea that you are as much as part of the environment, but also you are the environment. And the environment makes you, you make it, whatever that it is. And so if you take that into a space of relations, whether that is another human or a plant or, again, your puppy dog, then you have to realize that those relations are actually making you and you're making them. And so in the space between you and them, that's where everything happens. And again, I think for me, this is my interpretation of that little word. It's actually this making of each other all the time, which is quite unsettling in a way, because we would like, in our obsession for control, we would like to know that this is me, I can tell this is me, this is what I am. And I am the one moving through the environment. And instead to realize that actually the environment is moving with you. Everything is moving all at once. It's almost like imagine yourself being attached to a spider web. If you move, the entire web moves. There is no point that doesn't move if there is a movement anywhere on that web. And actually the web of the spider is designed exactly for that purpose, to alert the spider of any movement anywhere on the web. So it's a very powerful word, because it really forces us to change. In the first case, we are a separate entity from everything else, and we're not permeable. In the second case, we are so open that we even have to question whether we, as the unity that we think we are, actually exist. And my opinion is that we do not exist as a separate entity. There is an individual, but even in this individual, there are so many others that are like, who am I? I'm a collection. So I often, when I get invited for dinner, or friends invite me, like, shall we go for a coffee? And I often find myself replying like, yeah, we will come. And no, we can't make it. And they like, especially if it's a new friend, like we, thinking like, I just invited you. And I was like, yeah, I mean, like we, me and all of my other friends. And I'm not
me and my
about
guts, me and my microbes in the guts.
That's right. That's right. So,
Monica,
yeah, I don't know if that is a good example.
Monica, the way how you put it also it relates to the way how I guess we can imagine evolution of language as something that happened more than once in the history of life, the same way as, for example, evolution of eye and sight happened more than once, like with octopus, for example, having also eyes, but they have no evolutionary relationship to eyes of mammals or birds or vertebrates in general. And so I wonder when the evolution of language starts, or how would you introduce this idea that language actually might have very different forms that evolved completely separately from what we call language?
Well, again, if we take language as this, not as this, but as a space, actually, a space, a relational space where things are exchanged, information and meanings is created, co-created, and dismantled, then I think actually language comes with, as you mentioned before when you were reading apparently what I wrote. I can't even remember writing that, but obviously I must have. It's been a while. Yeah, it's inherent to life. So it doesn't evolve at some point, at some magical point, we started language. I think that language is inherent to the living process, the being life. It's required. It's that exchange and relational space. And because that is not optional, I mean, we are always speaking even when we are not saying anything. If you're sitting in a room and you're very sad, someone that knows you very well, they don't need to ask you. They already know that you're sad, that something is not right. So you've already spoken. And so, you can imagine your physiology is already, if you're sad, your physiology has already responded, and all of your inner world is already changed. Literally, your chemistry has already changed. And so at that level, language is just another word for life, in a way.
So, so should we approach it that instead of language, cognition, learning being properties of individuals or species, it is a property of any kind of interconnected system, any kind of organic system?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us some examples from the from plant kingdom now that are actually the main part of your experimental work? I would really like to hear about some, for example, your favorite personal experiment with plant communication.
Yeah, well, there are so many. I guess I can share. Okay, I can share an experiment that maybe the audience is familiar with, because it's my own take, a vegetal take of a famous experiment that was done with dogs, actually, again, with animals. And but before I get to that experiment, actually, no, I'll share the experiment first, and then I'll tell you how that experiment came about. And it will answer the question, hopefully, and also a bit more. So the experiment was done with pea plants, so the garden, the green pea. And it's very simple. It copies, literally, a famous experiment done by Pavlov with dogs. In that case, with the dog, the experiment goes that Pavlov, ring a bell, and and then serves dinner to the dog. And after a few of those repeated experiences, the dogs realizes that, every time that the bell rings, I get my dinner. And so Pavlov one day, he was a scientist, he rings the bell, but he doesn't give the dogs his dinner. And the dog starts salivating in expectation for the dinner to arrive, because what he has learned is that the bell didn't mean anything at the beginning. It was just a bell. But then after repeated experience, and every time the bell anticipates the arrival of dinner, then even if dinner doesn't arrive, the bell alone is already eliciting this response of like, okay, dinner is coming. And so the dog in anticipation starts to salivate, which of course the dog is, is got expectation, is already has worked out that there is a relationship between these two signals, the dinner and the bell. One that is obviously very desirable, the dinner, and one that didn't make any sense, and now it's got a very important meaning. So I use the same setup, but of course, plants, the dinner for a plant is a bit different than the dinner for a dog. These are baby little pea plants, and but we know very well from lots of literature before my work that young plants, and pea plants in particular, are very happy having blue light. And light, of course, for plants is dinner. So I used a blue light in replacement of the dinner. And then I needed to find something that could replace the bell. And instead of a bell, I used a little fan, like a tiny little fan that actually the one that are inside your little laptops. And so I would present the fan first, and it would blow very gently. And of course, we checked that, the fan alone didn't really mean anything. So if the plant is only presented with the fan always and ever, the plant would not care about the fan, and it will just do its thing. Now, but if you present the fan and then present the light, the blue light, straight after, the same way as Pablo was doing, you ring the bell, then dinner comes, and you do that a few times, and you do that from one side and then another side. The young plants will learn that wherever the fan is coming from, the air from the fan is coming from, that's where the dinner, the light is going to come from. So in my case, to make sure that it was very clear what the plant was doing, I created a little maze. And it's just a simple, imagine a letter Y. So the plant is sitting at the bottom, and then it has to grow and decide which way to go. And the direction is, if the plant learned that the fan is actually anticipating the direction where the blue light, so dinner is coming, then the plant should be, if it's able to learn, it should be able to grow in that direction. And that is exactly what plants do, actually. So in my experiment, what happened was that the plants learned, just like the dog did, that something that didn't have any meaning, the fan, can acquire meaning. So the plants realized that it's associated to something that is highly desirable, the dinner, the blue light. And so over repeated experience, it creates this association between these two things. So it's making meaning. And then it changes the behavior to accommodate for that. The same way as the dog starts salivating in anticipation, the pea plants start growing to the direction that is expecting, from which is expecting the blue light to come. Even if, just like with Pavlov, in the test time, only the fan is presented and no blue light arrives. So now the reason for sharing this story is because, of course, it speaks of making meaning, interacting with your environment from the parent perspective, but also is a particularly important story for me as well, because in terms of communication or interspecies communication, as a personal story, before doing this experiment, I spent some time in the Amazon, and I was working with a tribal man who is a very amazing expert in plants. He was in his 80s, super fit, and he was teaching me through a quite strict regime how to enter into that conversation with plants. And during that time, one of the plants that I was working with, and I'm not talking about any hallucinogenic plants. This is a big tree actually, and is not necessarily hallucinogenic. So that is, the hallucinogenic stuff is not required. That's what I'm trying to say, although it can facilitate. And so during the night, I would have lots of dreams, but during the day, I was actually quite bored. And I would be just sitting there and trying to be aware of my thoughts and trying to be aware of anything that might be unusual. And then one morning, and I only really keep a diary when I'm traveling. And so one morning I was just putting down the record for the, okay, I had a bad night, or I dreamt well, or whatever. And I was writing in my diary. And then after a while, I found myself jotting down notes as of an experiment. And I started drawing the maze. And then I literally had this voice that I knew it wasn't my voice. It wasn't my mind telling me basically what to do. And I started, as if something was dictating, I started writing down exactly what I was told. And I was starting, and the details were very specific. It was like, okay, you need to, do it this way and not that way. And this is how many times you do it. This is what you're going to use. And before going to the Amazon that time, when I was in the lab just before, I was trying to do something along the lines of an experiment on learning with plants, but I was looking at sunflowers. And so while I'm in the Amazon, and the experiment wasn't working. So while I'm in the Amazon, here is a plant that is dictating to me the experiment that I'm supposed to be doing next. And then also said like, by the way, no sunflowers, peas. And I was like, what? And it's like, yeah, sunflowers is the wrong plant for this, peas. So, I came home after that trip, and of course I have this diary full of diagrams and full of like precise details of how to do this experiment. And I booked the lab space so that, we can set it up, and I started setting it up. And for 2 weeks, I followed exactly the instructions that I was given with the peas, no sunflowers. And I set up the experiments exactly as I was told by this plant. And after 2 weeks going in every day, and it was quite a demanding routine, I was convinced the experiment wasn't working. And not only that, but I felt like, oh, what an idiot. I thought that, seriously, you really think that you're going to be, doing what a plant tells you while you're in the Amazon or something? And so one day I was about to come into the lab just to dismantle everything. And I felt really silly. I felt like, oh my God, you're losing it. What's going on? And then a little something told me, like, before you turn, because the experiment was always done in the dark, so that, the blue light that the peas would receive would be exactly the only source of light that they would receive. And so I'm entering this room, it's pitch black, and it's cold because peas like to grow in 16, 18 degrees, while outside was like 40. And I go in there, and I'm standing there in the dark, and there is this little voice inside me that says, like, wait, before you turn those lights on, have one more look inside the maze. And so I looked in thinking, like, what more now? Isn't it enough already? And I don't know, in that moment, I saw something. Actually saw that the experiment that was running now for 2 weeks has been working since the beginning. It's just that I was so conditioned to expect my experiment to work in a specific way, according to my learning, my own training, that I couldn't actually see what was being shown. And so instead of dismantling everything, that was actually the beginning of an experiment, which is what I described to you just before, which eventually resulted in the demonstration that plants can learn by association, so making meaning between two things, one that has got a meaning already and one that doesn't have any meaning, but it acquires meaning over time through experience. And in a way, just in the same fashion that your dog does, or we do, and everyone, many of organisms, the one that we have looked at, can do it. Of course, the big deal here was that plants don't have a brain, and we are so obsessed with the fact that to do this kind of learning, you need to have a brain. And instead, it's just showing that the brain is overrated. And mine definitely is, because obviously I didn't need to use my brain. I was just told what to do.
This brings me to a more general point about, let's say, anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism and language, that usually we expect that communication looks in certain way. It should resemble what we call communication by means of how it looks like or how it sounds like. That's also the reason, I guess, why birds still kind of make sense for us to communicate when we look at it from the anthropocentric perspective, but not bees. And so I wonder, like, how do you avoid this danger when we actually invest too much of human preconceptions into what we expect will be the communication in the plant world?
Yeah. I was trained, as many scientists, I would say all scientists are, we are trained to, first of all, you're not looking at subject, you're looking at objects. And you wouldn't project the human into an object. And so you wouldn't make a box. You wouldn't say a box is smiling at you. So, and I think what I learned in the process of undoing that conditioning in a way, because a box is not smiling, or it is not smiling, or it is smiling, it just doesn't matter, a human smile. And that's all we know, like the smile is this. And then whether we want to use that word to point to other things that look similar, it's a different question. And so I was trained to avoid anthropomorphism, of course. It's almost like it's heretical, you get burnt at the stake if you do it. But what I've learned over the time, and I was already, because I was trained, I only started working with plants much later in my career, but I was trained, and I am still a marine scientist, and I worked with coral reefs and specifically fish on coral reefs. And it was on the reef that spending lots of time underwater with my fish that I actually had to come to the realization, which at this stage, even saying it sounds so silly. It's like, oh, did you need all of that time to work it out? But I did. That my fish were not objects, of course, they were subjects. And actually in my, especially with fish, because they're so different and so distant for us, and they're already one of those species that we're like, I don't know how to connect with this, it's so weird, and it's slimy, and it's got scales. And the only way I had, and we had, is to actually acknowledge that we can only see things through the lens of the human. It doesn't mean that there is a difference between making the lens of the human, so the anthropomorphizing of things, making that a primary and the most important way of the world, because that is what anthropocentrism, putting ourselves as the golden standards, and everything is to be measured against us, is, I think, a fallacy. And it's not only a fallacy in thinking, but also a very dangerous attitude, which I would say is what is causing all our trouble right now, environmentally speaking, but also as a species, internally, as a culture, as a society. Now, anthropomorphism allows us to, it's a way that allows us to enter, it gives us a possibility to enter in contact, to feel that there is a relational space between, in my case, like me and my fish. And it is through the anthropomorphism that I can enter that space and then meet the fish and allow the fish to be the subject that the fish is, rather than transform it into an object so that I can use it and manipulate it. And so I actually started embracing anthropomorphism. And it's different, anthropomorphism, not in the sense of, and now I'm going to say that my fish are smiling, but if a fish looks in a fish way, if a fish is looking tense and is looking nervous, and these words will be already considered anthropomorphic, but actually, if you spend enough time, you can tell. The same way as you can tell when your dog is looking uneasy or when he's a bit, concerned. Or these words are not, I don't find them inappropriate, because it's the only words that we have to be able to connect with that moment that the other is experiencing. We're not speaking them for the other. We're speaking them for us, so that we can have a reference point of like what it is that we're trying to point at. And again, by recognizing, for example, with a fish or even with a dog, that, oh, the dog is uneasy. Suddenly you are also put on alert. So something is being communicated. And that word, say, oh, the dog is uneasy, it might sound anthropomorphizing, but actually is opening that space. And maybe your dog is uneasy because there is a problem that you're not detecting, but he is. So again, that space of relation is being opened. And if you were just instead it's not possible to speak of the dog as being uneasy or being nervous, then you're not being attentive that maybe there is someone, trying to rob you, and your dog is alerting you. And so I am comfortable with anthropomorphizing.
Does it also mean that making this analogy with human behavior can be a useful way to unlock the world of meaning, the non-human world of meaning in this way? Because also I wonder whether it is not sometimes still at least interesting to look into linguistic or communicative behavior that is in a way really alien to us. Like I know about examples when, for example, plants communicate chemically. And I think that's a very different kind of communication than what we usually call communication. So can you tell us also more about this, like more material, stranger ways of communication from, again, our human perspective? Because I guess like it can be very useful, especially when we think about, okay, we are in the situation of a certain kind of ecological crisis, of climate crisis. And I guess like sometimes the planet really speaks to us in a certain way, but it is more about us somehow listening better, because it's not about expecting those non-human existences to communicate. I mean, to put it on face value, as we would say. I mean, like they wouldn't like throw it at us, like finally made warning. It's always something that we have to actually extract, discover, and listen to, rather than like expecting that it will be thrown at us in a way that is, digestible immediately.
Well, there is a lot to unpack there. First of all, we also use chemistry to communicate. But again, we don't give that priority, but actually our nose does a lot of the work. Probably it informs us more than our eyes. And yet it's under-acknowledged. So, the chemistry of plants is very similar, and they actually are pretty much doing it the same. It's like they're using certain chemicals to send certain information, whether it's about, hey, it's time to flower and reproduce, or whether it's like, hey, there is a problem around here, and we're warning you that there is a predator here. And so they're able to make these, it's quite interesting actually that they will be able to make these cocktails of chemicals, which are actually words. and a little bit more of a little chemical compared to another, the meaning changes. We do the same. When we are nervous, we sweat a lot, and the smell changes. And that's why, again, we're so surprised. Oh, dogs can detect cancer, But I can just imagine for a dog, possibly someone that is very sick and the body is so struggling and chemically is in a place of imbalance, which is a particular place. From the dog perspective, that person obviously smells different because the chemistry is different. And yet, just because we are not giving importance to that and we can at least consciously detect it, we think that it's such a magical thing that dogs do. But actually, this is happening all the time. And again, I mean, plants and animals use pheromones. What do you think we do when people go to a bar or to a nightclub? We put perfumes on exactly for that purpose, because we are trying to use the chemistry to be either more attractive or whatever it is that we're doing. So we're doing it, but it's almost like these are the forms, and chemistry is just one example. These are the forms of communication are just consider lesser forms, and in fact they guide a lot more than we think, and they speak to us a lot more than we think. Now, the other question, I guess, on the wider question of the situation with the planet and the climate, and it's very pertinent given that tomorrow the big talk starts.
COP26.
I think that, yeah, that's right. I think it's actually, it's interesting because, it is about communicating the problem one more time, but it's actually not I don't think we're listening. And the same way as we're not listening many times to other species, definitely we're not listening that the planet itself, it's not true that it hasn't told us anything. It's not true that it hasn't said that, hey, there is a problem here. The problem, like when I was little and I was in primary school, I was terrified when I got told about acid rain. And that was a few decades ago. And so the Earth and the planetary system has been talking to us for a while, telling us like, you guys are not doing things right. And this relationship is not healthy. We are not in good relationship with the rest of the web. So it's interesting because now we have yet another meeting where we are going to push our date of action to further away. And, it was 2020 first, then it becomes 30, then it becomes 40, then it becomes 50, as if we can have this little game where we humans sit down around a table communicating and then forget about it and not need to do anything while, we still keep doing business as usual. And so, the big countries are still producing the oil and the coal, and they will continue doing that because nobody is actually really speaking anything new. And maybe the point is that we have already spoken enough. And that kind of communication hasn't taken us very far because we are not really doing what is required. And so that's interesting. Thank you for bringing it up because it's an important, I think it's an important point that it's timely, point of reflection.
So the best way how to reply to the planet is to act instead of talk.
Yeah, we've talked enough. I think.
Are there any questions from the audience? We have approached 50 or 55 minutes of conversation with Monica, so I would like to open up to the audience. If you have any questions, I see one right there. I'm not sure what's the method of getting a mic. It's right there. Is the person next to the camera? That was the first one, and then was one there. I see both of you. Yeah. Okay.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I wonder from your plant experiment, from what you described, it sounded almost like a scientific parallel of animism. Can you comment on that? And I also wonder, like this, for me, has moved the border of communication and expanded the territory. And I wonder, like, and also in the light of what Lukáš mentioned about listening to the planet, can we communicate with stones?
Yeah. Well, the answer is yes. For me, yes. And I'm not the only one. And yes, to your first question as well, maybe we need to, I don't know, maybe we need an animist scientist or a scientific animism. I don't know how to call it. I think it is definitely an animist approach. And of course, the story I shared coming from the Amazon is, a story that belongs to that tradition as well. What animism does is just allows everything, or I should say everyone, because there is no thing, to be alive and to have a life and to have something to say and to share. And so from that perspective as well, then rocks do also have a life and something to share. Rocks have, like, if we have problems with plants in terms of timeline, because they, big tree, they can be like centuries old. We cannot even conceive what that means, right? It's just like, it's so out of our human scale that it's just impossible for our mind to really grasp what it means to be sitting in one place or be rooted in the ground in one place for 800 years. Can you imagine that? It's like we get bored after 5 minutes and we have to go and check Facebook, So rocks and stones, so the stone people, their time scales are geological. They are even bigger, and so even more difficult to conceive for ourselves. But fortunately, there are still those with us that do remember how to do that, and do remember how to listen to them. And there are still, fortunately, places in this world where you can go, and because it's so quiet that you can actually hear the sound of the planet, like the sound of the actual planet, not the ones living on it, but the planet itself. And I'm not the only one that has had that experience, especially here in Australia. Once you move away from the coast, this is a very big country, and there are amazing spaces where there is just space, and it's just you and the country. And listening to country is a very Aboriginal, Indigenous Australian practice, and the Indigenous Australians have been doing that from the beginning, and they are one of the oldest cultures in the world. So I think that at the moment they are dated back to 80 or 120. I think that they're still deciding which date is correct, and even that is amazing, like 80 or 120,000 years of history. That is almost geological. And yet again, we cannot even conceive that these are also our ancestors, because we are all one species. And we cannot even conceive that we as a species have been around for so long. And for the majority of the time, we have been listening. Fortunately, as I said, some of these people are still here with us, and not just here in Australia, but sprinkled everywhere in the world, where there are still tribal people, native First Nation people And in my experience, they're actually, and I don't want to generalize because, of course, when you say they, it seems like they're all the same and one and only. Instead, there is a great diversity within that they. But yeah, in the experience that I had, the people that I have interacted with have been absolutely incredibly generous in sharing and teaching how to reconnect with this. So, and again, it's actually part of being human. So
it's great that
I think we have an opportunity for that conversation.
It's also great that we speak about geology here, which is literally a science of interrogating stones about past of the earth, and I guess like that explains very well like, what are the possibilities of talking to stones in a sort of metaphorical sense. But I wanted to bring one more reference. Like there's a wonderful book by Ji.hlava, which is called The Writing of Stones, and if anyone's interested in like how to perhaps do a bit of communicative action or communicative acts with stones, like it's a nice book to look into. The next question.
Hello, I have a question. Does it work? No. Could you mentioned that you were in a contact with one of the locals who helped you kind of to communicate with that tree in the Amazons, and that the process was kind of strict, or I don't know if I understood well. So could you maybe describe the approach or what the techniques, what he did for you in order to facilitate for you the communication? Thank you.
Yeah, so the man that I was working with belongs to a Kokama tribe, which is one of the tribes in the lower basin of the Amazon in Peru. And he like across the region there is a practice called dieta, and the dieta is a time of isolation and is abstinence from many things. So you're on your own, no sexual activity, pretty much no salt of any, source, and no sugars. So it becomes a very, very bland, plain, boring food that you eat days on end. And a dieta is the process. So you keep all of a little bit like is done in many of the meditation retreats when they are serious meditation retreats, like the food is kept very bland on purpose so that the system is not only is clean but also is quiet. And because some foods, like if you eat chili peppers, they agitate the body, and so the idea is to remove anything that agitates and excites the body, so that in that space the body quiets down, and then it expands. The space expands, and the dieta is a process. That's why it needs to be in isolation as well, so you don't really speak to anyone except the plants in that case. And it's surprising for us in the West, but actually by allowing that space, like it happens again in any very deep meditative retreat, then you start connecting and hearing things that you think are impossible for us to connect to, but actually it's actually such a common practice that there is nothing really special about it, except like that you need to commit to the discipline of doing that, so that you can enter a space that allows for that communication to take place. It's not necessary though to do a dieta to communicate with plants. After a while, when you learn how to listen and to quiet the inside, then the communication is open, and is open with plants as well as anything else. And then also, the land would speak and you will be able to hear it.
Other questions? Maybe Is it right there? Okay, I see. Great.
Hi, thank you for a nice talk. I wanted to ask more about the bioacoustics, or if I remember it right, that you were doing something like this, if it's the way how to not visualize, but made it more tactile or like more understandable, the language of the plants, or what is it exactly? If you can say about it. Thank you.
Yeah, so plant bioacoustics in animal ecology, so in the study of animals and their behaviors, we study sound, and how communication through sound occurs. And so we record the songs of birds, or we record dolphins, and we record all sorts of animals doing things. Well, plant bioacoustics is exactly the same, but it's recording the sounds of plants. So it's not thank you, because this is actually a very important question, especially in the last few decades. There have been on and off all sorts of devices on the market that they're claiming to allow you to listen to the music of plants. And I would just like to make a note on that, because first of all, music is a human thing, and plants don't make music. They produce sound like we do, like everyone else does. And not only that, but they also emit their own sound. And that sound, whether it's emitted by the plants or received by the plants, carries meaning, as it does, for other species, animals in particular. And it's useful. It's useful because carrying meaning means that it can be useful for the plants in their life. So what we did, it was like, I guess this idea that plants have a voice and they produce sound, that they make sound, it's not new. Actually, in fact, I think Darwin himself used to play the oboe to his plant because he was convinced that they could hear him, and they liked it. I don't know, the plants never had a chance to say a thing to Darwin to confirm that or not. Or maybe she did and he never wrote about it, I don't know. But so this idea that plants are listening to sound and plants are emitting sounds is not new, it's been around. And I guess what we were missing was the technological tools to be able to access that. So one thing is to think like, I think the plant is listening, or I think the plant is got a voice and it can make sounds. And another thing is I can hear it, I can record it. And so now we just have simply the technology to be able to record that. And the technology is actually also quite it can be very complex, or it can also be quite simple. The complicated version of is the one that we have in laboratory, and it can pick up very fine and specific vibrations because sound is an acoustic vibration, a mechanical vibration. And so we can do that, and that's what we did to start with. And that was the first time that we demonstrated actually the plant is emitting sound, and we can pick it up with these machines. There is also a kind of more accessible actually way to do this, and there are simple, they're not simple, but they are microphones that are used actually in water. They're usually used in the marine environment or in lakes and rivers to record sounds underwater. Because soil is actually semi-liquid, so it's considered more like water than actually solid. These microphones work very well, and you can put them underground, under the roots of a tree, and you're able to listen to what the tree is doing inside. And this is independently of what's happening, or independently, it's always dependent, but you're actually, for example, I have recordings where I have recorded the sounds of birds, but from the perspective of the tree, because the sound that I was recording was recorded from under the ground, from inside the tree. So in a way, the recording that I have is the sound wave that was the bird song, traveled through the air, it entered and penetrated and permeated the tree, and then it got picked up by my microphone. So those microphones are quite accessible, and I think it's quite fun because you can go and listen to the trees in your garden or on your streets if you want to. And people might think you're a bit strange if you're sitting there like with headphones on and you're listening, to the tree on the street. But hey, we're doing very strange things anyway, so might as well do something strange that is educational and it makes you to connect more. So I invite you.
Thank you. You have an additional question? Yeah.
I was wondering if you know more about the mechanics of this, the vibrations, if the plants have some special organelles or organs to emit sound, or if it's different and every part of the plant can make some sound, or just a little bit more specialized question. Thank you.
Yeah. It's an important question because it's, of course, we that's the next step. And I'm not particularly interested in mechanistics because there is a bit of a difference between ecologists and biologists. I'm an ecologist, which means I'm interested in the processes and how things relate, while the biologists are the ones that are in labs usually, and they are interested in the parts that make that thing do what it does. And so usually we can also define as like they're interested in the how it works, while we're interested in the why it works the way it works. And so they're just slightly different approaches. So while the mechanistics, which is what you're asking, is an important question, is not something that I'm interested in. So I leave it to other colleagues to do. And I think from my understanding at this stage, we don't really know exactly. But the importance in your question is also another point that you made, because again, we are so used to systems that are centralized, because we think that we are centralized in the brain and then everything comes from there, that when we approach systems that they are decentralized, so they don't have a specific organ that does something, so they don't have a brain, for example, or they don't have ears that like this is what does the detection of sound, then we run into like, oh, so how does it work? Almost thinking like, how can it be possible if a plant doesn't have ears? How can it be possible? And that's where I think plants are really good, because they are forcing us to consider other possibilities, and possibilities that we are not familiar with, for the simple fact that they are not present in this system, or we are not recognizing them in this system. But then other animals actually can help us to bridge that gap, because, for example, in the case of sound, we have ears, and that's how the sound gets collected and then processed. But take snakes. Snakes don't have ears, and yet they are extremely good at detecting vibration. And the reason why they're good at that, and how they do it, is because they're close to the ground, and they use the jaw. The bone of the lower jaw basically is the ear of the snake. And so the bone that is really close to the ground picks up all of the vibrations, and it gets processed as we process our vibration through the ear. And the snake has, snakes are very good at detecting even a tiny little movement, and they know that the little mouse is over there. So this is a good example of something that, like, the snake doesn't have ears, and yet he's doing the thing of listening to sound. So then you can do the next step and say, okay, the plant doesn't have ears and doesn't have a brain, and yet he's listening to the sound. And I know that he's listening to the sound because when a specific sound comes in, the plant actually changes the behavior. What it's doing is changed by the presence of that sound. And we have some beautiful example arising and emerging now that is really, there is no doubt that they are interacting, and it makes sense. They wouldn't be here. They wouldn't be surviving and thriving for so many millennia.
I'll give space for last, or penultimate question, if there's some more from the audience. I can't see very well because of, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm not looking to the left. This way I should. Please, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk, it's very inspiring. I was just wondering, what steps do you think we should make as individuals or as a society in general in order to listen again to the nature? Is it even possible in nowadays culture, industrialized, capitalist society? Like, do you think we have hope, actually? Because I agree with you that this anthropocentrism is in the roots of all the current ecological problems, or in the way we treat animals, for instance. But I was wondering, do you have some hope for the humanity that we can turn this again and like start listening to nature again?
Can I paraphrase the question if I understand it right? It's like, so how do we save the world? Is that what you're asking? I actually don't think we need hope. Hope to me is almost these days this feeling that someone is going to save us. We don't need hope. We just need to engage. And we are pretending that we don't know what we need to do. And we are pretending that we don't know what the solution is. But actually, we all know what the solution is. We all know what we need to do. And until we actually do what we know we need to do, then whether we have hope or not, whether we're pretending or not, it doesn't really matter. That's why we can have yet another meeting, but without the proper action. And we all know what it is. And we all, I'm actually very optimistic about the future. I feel like we have the level of development of the technology. It's to a point that if technology was used for what is really supposed to be, an extension that facilitates and enrich instead of, I don't think we're using technology at its best all the time. Technology could help us very easily to bridge the gap. Just think about this right now. I was describing before how to listen to a tree, and I mentioned hydrophones, so microphones. You put headphones on, and this is technology that is facilitating a practice that actually didn't really need headphones or mics, and yet, we are learning again. So why not embracing that? So, okay, we're going to learn again how to listen. Excellent. What do I need? Because I don't really know how to listen. Okay, I'm gonna get the help of a mic and a pair of headphones. And in my own experience, and this actually recently, there is a big tree on the property where I'm renting, and I climbed it. And I sit on it, and usually I put the hydrophones or the microphone underneath, and then I go along cables, I climb on the tree, and I sit on top with my headphones on, and I just sit there and listen to the tree doing its thing. And I often wonder, like, I know I'm sitting on you. How does that feel? And so I'm just listening. And then one day, a few weeks ago, I decided to take my headphones off. And I, got close to the trunk, and I put my ear closed, and I just started listening without the aid of anything. And you will be surprised. It's just literally like any exercise. If you listen and you start practicing, and whether you're using, like when you learn to do the bike thing, you put the learning wheels, and then eventually you take the wheels off, and you can bike and no problem. So this technology is our learning wheels. And then at some point, if you are practicing enough, you will be able to listen and hear without the need of anything, just the fact that you are the instrument that you were looking for. So, that listening that you are asking for, it's already available. It's just literally a matter to go anywhere. You don't need to be anywhere special. We don't need to go to the Amazon to do this, And you will be surprised, because in that experience, there are many things. There is the listening, but there is also the fact that you're taking time away from any device other than your headphones. And the reason why is because if you have your phone on, you will hear the buzz of the phone, the mobile, looking for connection. So you have to turn the phone off. And so suddenly there is a point of, okay, you're not connected by phone, you're just doing this. You're connecting with this tree and the place with the tree, and you are standing in that moment. And it just brings you to a different space altogether. And my housemate, when I'm feeling a bit anxious or whatever, especially because here in Australia we've been in lockdown forever, we still kind of are. It just said to me many times, like, Monica, just go climb your tree. And why? Because when I go and then I come back, I'm often in a much more zen state. I'm much quieter and I feel more at peace, and I feel like I can deal with things. Because we know that the medicine that we are looking for is the connection to our own nature, which is what we are pointing to. And so like, that's nature, but actually that is our own nature. And that's why it's also more important than ever to recognize this, because when we talk about, we're going to save the world and change the environment and the climate and all of that, we're not realizing that what we're talking about is not something out there. That's the old model of the cognitivist, input, output. The actual reality is that there's something out there. The climate is this climate that is not working. The distraction of the earth and the excavation of the beautiful things, and the distraction through burning and not caring and polluting, is this distraction, is this polluting. We're not separate from the web. We're just a dot on the same web that is creating everything. So these are important practices because they're so simple and they look so innocent. And yet, if you practice enough, you will then suddenly be inspired to do things differently. And so it's easy to start. There is no need for hope.
Thank you, Monica. It's time to wrap up. Unfortunately, this conversation is really inspiring, so it does a great justice to the name of Inspiration Forum, since it delivers, I hope, a lot of inspiration to all of you. But I will have to wrap it up now, and also to wrap up by means of like highlighting few main insights, let's say, that we could learn from Monica's expertise. So first, I really admire the way how we can redefine now together language as something that is a meaning-making activity that is distributed in the whole ecology, in the whole network, rather than individuals or specific species. And then also, I'm thrilled to kind of also use perhaps in my practice or in practice of you that sit in the audience, this difference between anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism. I think that was a really useful distinction that you made in during this conversation. And then finally, I'm also happy that we came to this general call to action that sometimes it is better to listen instead of speak too much or speak over someone else speaking. So let's give space to all the different actors that we can to, speak up and give them the space also, or give us the space not to speak, but instead of that, just listen to those actors. And Monica, thanks so much for the opportunity to listen to you and to speak to you. So I hope you had a great time as well, and hopefully see you again at some other occasion. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for everyone who was here for the whole time. Thanks so much for your engagement and questions, and see you at other programs of the Inspiration Forum at Ji.hlava.